Hi, my name is Daniel Moss, and I'm really glad you're joining us today in Hope and Healing, a place where we can come together and safely talk about some of the burdens, insecurities, and craziness of the world through a biblical worldview. We're toward the beginning of a series on church hurt. Now, in our last episode, we defined the problem, and today we'll be confronting the problem of, is church hurt a systemic issue? Here with me to discuss it is our senior pastor, Jason Crute. Now, Jason, talk to me about what you hear when you hear, is church hurt a systemic issue?
It's a very broad question, and I would say I probably hear it more in that academia, like theory concept. And in a lot of ways, I like to alter the question a little.
Okay.
All right.
So,
So sometimes the best answer is to ask another question.
Sure.
But part of that is there any relationship, so church relationship, is there any relationship you enter where hurt is not a possibility? And that's where I think it starts to get more practical, where you're out of this overgeneralization and zooming into, well, what relationships are worth risk? What really and that can be in a lot of things, from marriage, friendships. The one I would often point to is kids. When you decide to have kids, it could be the most fulfilling thing in all of your life to actually see your flesh and blood and all of that joy that's sometimes even hard to explain. But also kids can also bring some of the biggest drama and terror and hurt, because what if their lives don't go the way it's scripted in your mind?
Sure.
And so it's that give and take of, like if you risk to have kids, but there also can be deep hurt in kids, but I would still say kids are worth it, at least from my perspective. So that's why altering the question a little to try and get more specific.
Yeah. So, and we can do that, right? Sometimes when using another example, when spouses have a conversation, when one says something, the other may hear something different. So when we hear a systemic issue, we may hear something other than what people are posting. I think what people are seeming to say, now I've been browsing the Twitterverse for a long time on this topic, and everyone says it's a systemic issue on evangelical churches. You are super prone to get hurt when you enter into this system. And so what do you think it is that people mean when they are saying, anything will have risk, right? Everyone agrees that there's risk everywhere. But what do you think people mean when they are kind of implying that there's extra risk in the church? Is there extra risk in churches?
Again, I would love to push back on that to say, no, there's no extra risk than who your best friend is, or who you've chosen to be your peer group. I'm never going to say there's no risk. So don't put those words into the mouth of there's could be hurt, but you're really pushing to go, you have to risk to understand depth of relationship too.
Yeah.
And so the more that you understand, all right, this is a risk, and the problem is with church or anything external, you don't get to write the script. Sometimes the script is written for you, and so that's even interacting in public. The script is sometimes, so you're right, you're humbling yourself and submitting to something, but I also would go, the reward is greater than anything.
The risk is worth the reward in
right.
the end. So I guess what would you say then to people who would say that, the church, if anywhere is safe, the church should be a safe place. Shouldn't the church be safer than your average relationship?
So I suppose the real question becomes, it depends on what your view of God is. Because if you're writing your own script to create your own God and that's your safety, the church is full of risk. Because God does not get put into our boxes. You don't get to create your own God. Even if you say, all right, I want to chase biblically defined God, there's still risk against all of the culture you live in, whether that's the culture we live in now, whether it's, again, for us being in the United States, whether it's culture at some other point in this world right now, whether it's historic or future culture, God's not bound by that. So all of a sudden you bring in your own definition of God with your own definition of acceptability within culture, why are we surprised if people are hurt by that?
Mm.
So there is risk in that. The more that you're saying, I get to define God, but there's also other big problems with that. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. How you view God is going to inevitably reach into how you experience God's people too, right?
Right.
What is it about? Are there some churches, evangelicalism is like a really broad umbrella. And so it's a little unfair. And everyone, even those in church hurt would know, like, maybe some specific churches are okay, but they would say in the vast majority are unsafe, or you're more prone to get hurt in those. And so can you speak into that a little bit? Like, what makes one church safer than another church?
Uh-huh.
Is there a difference between a safe church and an unsafe church?
So I would say yes. And again, safety being still risk, but I would say there are safer because they focus on the right things. And so I think examples of that would be some churches, because of personalities, it's over focused on a personality that then if you and that personality, whether it's leadership, whether it's a very influential member, if you're over emphasized in that, well then you don't have that ability to say, this is going to be safe for me. You should seek a church that humbles itself and looks more and more the way Jesus has called us to live. But again, it goes back to submitting to the God of the Bible and the way that he's called us to live. And even to look at the Bible, you cannot argue that risk isn't there. I love the story of John, I think is John 11, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. But that's not where that starts. It starts with him dealing with both sisters individually and seeing the depth of their hurt. And it leads to the fact of Jesus, and without the commentary statement, whether it's because of the sisters' hurt, whether it's because of the grief of Jesus, whether it's because of their lack of faith, whatever reason, Jesus weeps with them. And so you see the humility of a Savior who, for reasons that we can take guesses at, but for reasons is moved to an emotional response of deep grief. Well, if he didn't enter those relationships, you can't grieve deeply. Like I would even say there's risk of not entering relationship. Like you cannot know God if you're not in a church at the level that he's called you to know him, because he's set up the church as his avenue, as his earthly representation of self. So the Bible never points to just go do your solo thing and cut out church and you and I are good. It's always push into community, push into a bunch of different giftings, which means different personalities, and risk together so that people see the unity you possess.
Yeah. So like going back to the parent-child analogy, you can live your life alone by yourself and never take any relational risk at all. And you can understand a measure of relationship and love and, family, even to a point. But if you take the risk and you have the kids, you get married to somebody, then you're of course you take the risk that those children may disown you, that person that you link up with for life may disappoint you or leave you or break your heart. But you take the risk to learn more about, to experience deeper relationship. And so that's kind of what I hear you saying.
Right.
The church is like, we enter into the church so that we can know God better. God set up the church and we do our best. Some churches better than others, maybe. Do our best to put it together in a way that God has kind of ordained for it to be. But when we step into that, we take that risk for the purpose of knowing God better through his people.
Yeah, and even using your analogy, because sin is still present in the world, even if you stay married for 50, 60 years, if Jesus doesn't come back, which don't know the time.
Right,
but
disclaimers all.
Yes,
right.
disclaimers all. But if he doesn't come back, there's still going to be loss. And so like I've done plenty of funerals, even for people who've been married 60 plus years, who the grief is just as deep as if it was an accident after year one, or, because the relationship is, and that's not, God never intended it that way. That's still a product of sin, and that Satan's still around, and that death is still entering physical bodies.
Yeah.
But I don't think any of those relationships would look back on their 60 years going, nah, I should have just hedged my bet so I wouldn't be here weeping.
I should have never stepped into that because I'm currently experiencing
Right.
pain.
Right. Yes. And so again, Jesus, I love the Philippians 2 is one of those passages I really enjoy, but it says where Jesus, in being very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. So even Jesus himself enters relationship in Garden of Gethsemane, like if I don't have to do this, it'd be great, God, not my will, yours be done. So like, it's not like Jesus was like, man, this is awesome. He knew the suffering, he knew the pain, but he was willing to go, if this is glorifying to God, and in a lot of ways, that should be our thought process.
Yeah.
If
And
it
like,
glorifies God.
yeah, and like when a spouse dies or something horrible happens in relationships, that doesn't mean that we're totally always ready to just jump right back in to the situation that hurt us, right? If a spouse dies, we don't just jump right into a romantic relationship again. But after time, there is healing that can happen, and there is a reentry that can happen. And I think how we can encourage people is that if you were hurt within the church, whether it's the church's fault or no, if you were hurt, it's okay to mourn that. And it's okay to take a step, but then with always the hope to see, maybe I can enter this again because there is something good ahead of me that's worth that risk.
Right. Yeah. And even with the spouse, it doesn't mean you have to go out and get married again.
Yeah.
But things like grief share and ministries that help people mourn, some of the biggest fulfillment is to realize, yes, I can process these emotions and continue to move on, to say, since I'm here and I have breath, I still have purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there are kind of two things that the church set up, or the systemic nature of the church, if we can use that term, can contribute to church. Or number one, if your relationship with God or the church, if your relationship with Jesus is not right, then you're going to view the church. Something's going to break there. If you don't know who Jesus is, if you aren't spending time actively pursuing Jesus or listening to the Holy Spirit in your life, then you're naturally going to have a falling out, just like I would with my spouse or my kids. If I'm not in that relationship, then I'm not gonna really. I'm going to have some kind of fracture there, right? And conversely, if the church, you mentioned this earlier, if the church is actively pursuing things that aren't of Jesus, right? Silo ministries, egocentric pastor, or even very powerful lay person, if those things are present, then they're not pursuing the way of Jesus. So it sounds like it takes two parties, the church pursuing the way of Jesus and the individual pursuing the way of Jesus, to really minimize church hurt. Was that what?
Yeah. Yes, I would agree with that. And in a lot of ways, you control your own growth. But then when you said at the very beginning, are there churches that are healthy to enter into? You then have to be the person who tries to navigate, how do I enter then this second part that I don't control? How do I pick well so that I'm going in and attaching to people who are going to push me towards Jesus and not towards something else?
Okay.
So
wonderful. So from what I'm getting from this whole conversation, if we can answer that, is there a systemic issue in the church? Or maybe better phrase, is there something in the church that causes unnecessary risk of getting hurt? We would say the answer to there being unnecessary risk is generally no, but look at the church that you're walking into. Is it following Jesus? Are you following Jesus? And if you are both going in the same direction, then our answer would be no, there's no inherent risk stepping into church above anything else in the world.
Right. Yes. Above any other relationship you might enter.
Always risk somewhere.
Always risk. And the deeper the relationship, which you hope church is one of your deeper relationships, the deeper the relationship, the harder the hurt would be. And there is no perfection here of healthy in year 1 might not be healthy in year 12.
Sure.
So there's always this navigation of, are they focusing still on Jesus, or has it turned into people, stuff, money, entertainment, whatever it is, society, or is it still going? How do we push you into a deeper relationship with the Lord?
Absolutely. You can always get hurt when something deviates from the way of Jesus. That's how everything is designed, right? When things are running,
as long as Satan's around,
as long as the world is broken, things are going to go wrong.
Right.
And we are as much a part of that as anyone else, as much as a church, the individual. If we deviate from the way of Jesus, something's going to get hurt.
Right.
Man, Jason, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you so much for watching this video. We're going to continue to pursue this topic of church hurt. Next video, we're going to be talking about, is there things that the church teaches that is maybe makes people more prone to get hurt in church and experience this church hurt? And we have a lot more episodes to go, so check the description below if you have any questions on what's coming up, because we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.